In a quiet little town surrounded by green hills and wide-open fields, there lived a man named Thomas Calloway. He was in his late 40s, with sun-tanned skin from working long hours under the bright sun. His farm wasn't huge, but it was everything to him. A place where he grew vegetables, raised chickens, and tended to fruit trees that swayed gently in the breeze. It was peaceful here, far away from the noise of big cities. The only neighbors nearby were members of a fancy gated community called the Homeowners Association, HOA. They had shiny cars, manicured lawns, and strict rules about how things should look. But Thomas didn't mind them much. He kept to himself and made sure his farm stayed neat so no one would complain. One crisp autumn morning, as Thomas was checking on his pumpkin patch, the sound of tires crunching on gravel caught his attention. A delivery truck pulled up near his mailbox and dropped off an envelope. Curious, Thomas wiped his hands on his overalls and opened it. Inside was a letter from the HOA board. At first glance, it seemed official, filled with legal jargon and formal language. But as Thomas read through it, his heart sank. The HOA claimed that part of his beloved farm actually belonged to them because of some old paperwork dating back decades. According to their interpretation, this slice of land wasn't really his anymore. It was now supposed to become a parking lot for the HOA's overflow vehicles. Thomas blinked at the words, thinking maybe he'd misunderstood. How could they take his land? This wasn't just dirt and grass. It was where he planted carrots, harvested apples, and let his goats graze. Without this piece of land, his entire farming operation would fall apart. Frustrated, he sat down on a bale of hay, staring at the letter in disbelief. What gave these people the right to march into his life and demand something like this? He thought about ignoring it, hoping it might go away if he pretended not to care. But deep down, Thomas knew better. Ignoring problems never solved anything, especially when dealing with folks like the HOA. These weren't ordinary neighbors. They were organized, persistent, and used to getting what they wanted. Still, Thomas wasn't ready to roll over without a fight. He had worked too hard to build his farm, and he wasn't about to let anyone take it away without putting up a struggle. The next day, determined to get answers, Thomas decided to investigate further. He drove into town and visited the county courthouse, digging through dusty files and faded maps to uncover the truth behind the HOA's claims. After hours of searching, he found something shocking. Years ago, when the HOA's developers bought the surrounding land, they hadn't been careful about defining clear boundaries. Because of this oversight, a small section of Thomas's property ended up ambiguously tied to the HOA's master plan. Technically, the HOA could argue that this sliver of land fell under their jurisdiction. Armed with this knowledge, Thomas felt more prepared, but also angrier than ever. Later that week, he paid a visit to Margaret Hensley, the head of the HOA. She was known for being sharp-tongued and unyielding, but Thomas hoped reason might prevail. Sitting across from her in her polished office, he showed her the documents proving his case. Instead of backing down, Margaret smirked and waved off his evidence. "You're just one person," she said dismissively. "We have resources you can't even imagine." As Thomas walked out of the meeting feeling defeated, an idea began forming in his mind. If the HOA thought they could push him around, they were wrong. There was something they didn't know, something powerful enough to make them reconsider their demands. And Thomas was ready to use it. Thomas couldn't shake off the frustration that had settled in his chest after his meeting with Margaret. Her smug attitude and dismissive words replayed in his mind like a broken record. How could someone so casually disregard years of hard work and dedication? He knew he needed to dig deeper if he wanted to protect his farm. Determination burning inside him, Thomas decided to visit the county courthouse once again. This time, he wasn't just looking for answers. He was searching for ammunition. The courthouse smelled faintly of old paper and polished wood, its halls lined with shelves stuffed with dusty files. Thomas spent hours sifting through records, flipping through yellowed maps, deeds, and contracts. His fingers were stained with ink from handling decades-old documents, but he didn't care. Finally, buried deep within a folder labeled Historical Land Use, he found what he was looking for, a map showing the original property lines before the HOA's gated community even existed. It clearly marked his farm as separate from the subdivision. But there was more. A handwritten note attached to the file revealed that when the developers built the HOA's infrastructure, they hadn't properly updated or clarified the boundary lines. Instead, they rushed through the process, leaving behind a legal loophole. Armed with this new evidence, Thomas felt a flicker of hope, but also anger. The HOA's claim wasn't just unfair, it was based on laziness and greed. They hadn't done their homework back then, and now they expected him to pay the price. Still, Thomas knew facts alone wouldn't be enough. People like Margaret thrived on power plays, not logic. He needed something stronger, something that would make them sit up and listen. That evening, as Thomas sat at his kitchen table surrounded by papers and notes, his eyes wandered to the corner of the room where an old toolbox rested. Inside it was a key, a small, unassuming piece of metal that unlocked the main electrical transformer on his property. Years ago, when the HOA was building their community center, developers approached Thomas for permission to run power lines through his land. In exchange, they allowed him to retain control over the transformer, which supplied electricity to the entire neighborhood. At the time, it seemed like a harmless agreement, a way to keep peace with his neighbors. But now it dawned on Thomas that this tiny detail gave him enormous leverage. He leaned back in his chair, letting the realization sink in. If the HOA refused to back down, he could cut off their electricity. It wasn't a decision he took lightly. After all, turning off the lights might inconvenience innocent families who had nothing to do with the dispute. But maybe, just maybe, a temporary outage would force the HOA to reconsider their stance. After all, how long could they afford to live without power? The next morning, Thomas drafted a formal letter to the HOA board. In clear, professional language, he outlined his findings about the property lines and reminded them of his role in maintaining their power supply. He didn't threaten outright, but he made sure to hint at the consequences of ignoring his concerns. "I value our community's well-being," he wrote, "and I'm confident we can resolve this matter amicably." The subtext was clear: cooperate or face the consequences. When the letter arrived at the HOA office, Margaret read it with growing irritation. She dismissed it as posturing, convinced that Thomas wouldn't dare follow through. "He's bluffing," she muttered to her assistant. "No one would risk alienating the whole neighborhood over a few acres." But deep down, doubt crept in. What if he wasn't bluffing? For the first time since the conflict began, Margaret hesitated. Meanwhile, Thomas waited patiently, knowing the ball was now in their court. Whatever happened next, he was ready. Days passed, and the HOA's response to Thomas's letter was silence. No phone calls, no emails, no attempts to negotiate. Just radio silence. It was as if they were daring him to make the next move. Thomas wasn't surprised. He had seen Margaret's smug confidence during their earlier meeting, and he knew she probably thought he lacked the guts to follow through on his subtle warning. But Thomas wasn't the kind of man to back down when pushed into a corner. If the HOA wanted to play games, he was ready to show them just how serious he could be. Late one night, after the stars had taken over the sky, and the world around his farm fell quiet, Thomas made his decision. He grabbed a flashlight and walked toward the transformer at the edge of his property. The metal box hummed softly with electricity, a reminder of the power it carried, not just for his own home, but for the entire HOA community. He hesitated for a moment, thinking about the families inside those houses. Would this cause trouble for people who weren't involved in the fight? He shook off the doubt. The HOA had left him no choice. They had ignored his polite requests, dismissed his evidence, and acted like his livelihood didn't matter. Now it was time to remind them that actions have consequences. With a deep breath, Thomas flipped the switch. The hum stopped instantly, plunging the neighborhood into darkness. Street lights went out, porch lights flickered off, and the faint glow of TVs disappeared from windows. Thomas stood there for a moment, listening to the sudden stillness. Then, without another glance, he turned and headed back to his house. He didn't feel triumphant, just resolute. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making the HOA understand that they couldn't bulldoze over him without facing repercussions. By morning, chaos had erupted in the gated community. Residents woke up to find their coffee makers dead, their refrigerators warm, and their garage doors stuck shut. Parents scrambled to get kids ready for school, only to discover that alarm clocks hadn't gone off and electric toothbrushes were useless. At the community center, a fitness class was canceled because none of the equipment worked. Complaints flooded the HOA office, and Margaret Hensley found herself bombarded with angry calls from neighbors demanding answers. Desperate for a solution, Margaret contacted the utility company, hoping they could fix the problem quickly. But when the technicians arrived and inspected the transformer, they told her the issue wasn't on their end. It originated from Thomas's property. Realization hit Margaret like a ton of bricks. She stormed across the field separating the HOA from Thomas's farm, her face red with fury. When she reached his front door, she pounded on it with enough force to rattle the frame. Thomas answered calmly, as if he'd been expecting her. "Good morning, Margaret," he said, leaning against the doorway with a cup of coffee in hand. His generator hummed quietly in the background, powering his own home while the rest of the neighborhood sat in the dark. "You cut off our electricity." Margaret snapped, pointing an accusing finger at him. "Do you realize what you've done? People are furious." "I'm aware," Thomas replied evenly. "But I also know you've been ignoring my letters and refusing to address the real issue here. My farm is not your parking lot." "This is outrageous," Margaret sputtered. "You can't just hold an entire neighborhood hostage." "Actually," Thomas said, taking a sip of his coffee, "I can. And I will, until we reach an agreement that works for everyone, including me." Margaret opened her mouth to argue but stopped short. For the first time, she saw the steely determination in Thomas's eyes. He wasn't bluffing. He wasn't going to back down. And unless she wanted the HOA to remain powerless indefinitely, she needed to rethink her strategy. As she stomped away, fuming, Thomas watched her go with a mix of satisfaction and unease. He had drawn a line in the sand, and now it was up to the HOA to decide whether they would cross it, or finally come to the table ready to talk. The hours following Margaret's angry visit felt like a storm brewing. Word spread quickly through the HOA community about what had happened, or rather, what Thomas had done. Neighbors gathered in driveways and huddled near the community center, whispering about the blackout. Some were furious, calling Thomas selfish and unreasonable. Others seemed almost intrigued, curious about the quiet farmer who had managed to bring their polished, rule-bound neighborhood to its knees. But one thing was clear: no one liked living without electricity. Margaret, meanwhile, paced her office like a caged animal. She hadn't expected Thomas to actually follow through on his threat. In her mind, he was just a mild-mannered farmer who wouldn't dare rock the boat too much. Now she realized she had underestimated him, and it infuriated her. The pressure from residents was mounting, and if she didn't fix the situation soon, her leadership might be called into question. Still, admitting defeat wasn't an option. Not yet. That afternoon, Margaret called an emergency meeting of the HOA board. The room buzzed with tension as members argued over how to handle the crisis. One suggested calling the police, accusing Thomas of vandalism or extortion. Another proposed cutting off access to his water supply in retaliation. But cooler heads prevailed when Sarah Chen, a quieter member of the board, spoke up. "Maybe we're looking at this the wrong way," Sarah said calmly. "Thomas isn't asking for money or revenge. He just wants us to listen. If we keep ignoring him, this is only going to get worse." Her words hung in the air, silencing the room. Reluctantly, the board agreed to try negotiating again, but this time, they would take Thomas's demands seriously. Margaret, still seething, reluctantly led the charge. Later that evening, a group of HOA representatives arrived at Thomas's farm. They looked out of place among the rustic scenery, dressed in pressed slacks and blazers, while standing awkwardly near his chicken coop. Thomas greeted them politely but firmly, inviting them to sit at a weathered picnic table under the shade of an old oak tree. He poured glasses of lemonade from a pitcher, the ice clinking softly against the sides. It was a small gesture, but it set the tone for the conversation ahead. "We're here to discuss your concerns," Margaret began stiffly, avoiding eye contact. "Clearly, there has been a misunderstanding." Thomas raised an eyebrow. "A misunderstanding? You mean the part where you claim my land belongs to you?" Margaret flinched but pressed on. "Look, we understand now that the property lines are complicated. Maybe we acted too hastily. But turning off our power isn't helping anyone. Can we find a solution that works for both sides?" For the first time, Thomas allowed himself a small smile. "I'm glad you're finally willing to talk. Here's the deal. I'll restore your electricity immediately if you agree to drop this ridiculous claim about my farm being a parking lot. And moving forward, any decisions involving my property need to include me in the discussion." The board members exchanged uneasy glances. This wasn't exactly what they'd hoped for, but they knew they didn't have much leverage. Without electricity, life in the HOA was grinding to a halt. Businesses couldn't operate, families were inconvenienced, and tempers were running high. Finally, after some whispered deliberation, Margaret nodded curtly. "Fine," she said through gritted teeth. "We'll withdraw our claim. For now. But don't think this is over." "It's a start," Thomas replied, standing up and extending his hand. After a moment's hesitation, Margaret shook it, her grip firm but reluctant. As the HOA representatives left, Thomas watched them go, feeling a mix of relief and satisfaction. The battle wasn't fully won yet, but he had taken a crucial step toward protecting his farm. For the first time in days, he allowed himself to relax, knowing that the lights would come back on, not just for the HOA, but for a future where compromise might replace conflict. The agreement reached under the old oak tree was fragile, like a thin sheet of ice that could crack at any moment. Both sides knew it wasn't perfect, but it was a start, a lifeline thrown across the chasm of distrust and frustration that had grown between Thomas and the HOA. As the days passed, the neighborhood slowly returned to normal. Lights flickered back on, appliances hummed to life, and the angry murmurs among residents began to fade. But behind closed doors, tensions still simmered. For Thomas, restoring the electricity felt like lifting a weight off his shoulders, but he remained cautious. He didn't trust the HOA to keep their word, especially not Margaret, whose icy demeanor during their last meeting made it clear she wasn't happy about backing down. Still, he decided to give them the benefit of the doubt. For now. After all, the fight had taken its toll on him too. Late nights poring over legal documents, endless stress, and the emotional strain of standing up to an entire community had left him exhausted. A temporary truce, no matter how shaky, was better than nothing. On the other side of the fence, the HOA board wrestled with mixed feelings. Some members grumbled about giving in to Thomas's demands, calling him stubborn and unreasonable. Others, however, quietly admitted that maybe they had gone too far. Sarah Chen, in particular, found herself reflecting on the situation more deeply. She admired Thomas's determination and resourcefulness. Unlike many of her neighbors, she saw him not as an adversary, but as someone who simply wanted fairness. Over coffee one morning, she voiced her thoughts to Margaret. "Maybe we should try to make this work," Sarah said gently. "Thomas isn't going anywhere, and neither are we. Fighting him isn't helping anyone." Margaret sighed, rubbing her temples. "I know," she admitted reluctantly, "but I can't shake the feeling that we're letting him win." "It's not about winning or losing," Sarah replied. "It's about finding common ground. If we don't, this is just going to happen again." Her words struck a chord with Margaret, though she wouldn't admit it aloud. Deep down, she knew Sarah was right. The HOA couldn't afford another standoff, not when it disrupted lives and damaged the community's reputation. Slowly, begrudgingly, Margaret began to consider the possibility of compromise. With Sarah's encouragement, the HOA proposed a formal negotiation session. This time, they suggested meeting at a neutral location, the local coffee shop, a cozy spot with mismatched chairs and the comforting aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was far removed from the sterile conference rooms and tense atmospheres of previous discussions. When Thomas arrived, he noticed the change immediately. The casual setting seemed designed to ease tensions, and for the first time, he felt hopeful that progress might actually be possible. The meeting started awkwardly, with both sides exchanging polite but guarded pleasantries. Lawyers sat nearby, ready to jump in if things got heated, while mediators guided the conversation carefully. At first, it seemed like old arguments would resurface. The HOA accused Thomas of being inflexible. Thomas countered that their greed had forced his hand. Voices rose, tempers flared, and it looked like the whole thing might fall apart. But then, something unexpected happened. Sarah leaned forward, her voice calm but firm. "Let's focus on solutions instead of blame," she said. "What if we lease a small portion of Thomas's unused pasture for overflow parking during special events? That way, the HOA gets what it needs without taking away land that's critical to his farm." The room fell silent as everyone considered her proposal. To Thomas, it sounded reasonable, better than reasonable, actually. Leasing part of his property meant he'd retain ownership and control while earning some extra income. For the HOA, it solved their parking problem without requiring costly construction elsewhere. It wasn't perfect, but it was a middle ground. After hours of debate and revisions, both sides agreed to draft a formal lease agreement. As they shook hands to seal the tentative deal, Thomas caught Sarah's eye and gave her a small nod of gratitude. For the first time since the conflict began, he allowed himself to believe that peace might truly be within reach. Drafting the lease agreement turned out to be far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. What started as a simple idea, leasing a small portion of Thomas's pasture for overflow parking, quickly spiraled into a maze of legal jargon, fine print, and endless revisions. Both sides brought their lawyers to the table, each determined to protect their interests. The HOA wanted guarantees that the leased land would always be available when needed, while Thomas insisted on strict terms to ensure his farm remained undisturbed during regular days. Every clause sparked debate. Every word was scrutinized, and tempers occasionally flared. Margaret, still smarting from the earlier power outage, pushed hard for conditions that favored the HOA. She argued that the community should have unrestricted access to the leased area whenever they deemed it necessary. "We can't plan around your farming schedule," she snapped during one particularly heated session. "What happens if we need the space last minute?" Thomas folded his arms, his jaw tightening. "Then you'll have to figure something else out," he said firmly. "This is my livelihood we're talking about, not some empty lot. You don't get to barge in whenever you feel like it." The room grew tense, but before things could escalate further, Sarah stepped in. "Let's focus on finding a balance," she suggested, her tone calm but firm. "Maybe we can agree on specific dates or events when the parking will be used, with advance notice required. That way, everyone knows what to expect." Her suggestion broke the deadlock, and after some grumbling, both sides agreed to include a schedule in the contract. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. Slowly, painfully, the agreement began to take shape. Throughout the process, Thomas found himself warming up to Sarah. While most of the HOA board seemed intent on treating him as an obstacle, Sarah genuinely listened to his concerns. She advocated for compromises that respected his needs while addressing the HOA's challenges. Her quiet persistence earned her respect, not just from Thomas, but from some of her own colleagues too. Even Margaret, who rarely admitted fault, begrudgingly acknowledged that Sarah's approach might be the only way to resolve the conflict peacefully. As the final draft of the lease agreement came together, a sense of cautious optimism settled over both parties. The HOA gained access to much-needed parking space without encroaching on Thomas's core farming operations. In return, Thomas secured formal recognition of his ownership over the rest of his property and received fair compensation for leasing the land. More importantly, the agreement included safeguards to prevent future disputes, such as clear communication protocols and penalties for breaching the terms. By the time the contract was signed, weeks had passed, and the initial hostility had softened into something resembling mutual understanding. At the signing ceremony, a modest affair held at the same coffee shop where negotiations began. Handshakes were exchanged, and polite smiles replaced scowls. For Thomas, it felt surreal. Just months ago, he'd been bracing for a long, bitter fight. Now he stood alongside his former adversaries, agreeing to work together instead of against each other. Afterward, as Thomas drove back to his farm, he reflected on how far they'd come. The journey hadn't been easy, but it taught him valuable lessons about standing his ground while remaining open to compromise. He realized that sometimes, even the toughest battles could lead to unexpected alliances and growth, if you were willing to meet halfway. Back at the HOA office, Sarah poured herself a cup of tea, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment. She knew the road ahead wouldn't always be smooth, but she believed this agreement marked a turning point. By choosing empathy over aggression, they had taken the first step toward building a stronger, more united community, one that valued cooperation over conflict. Months passed after the signing of the lease agreement, and life in the small town began to settle into a new rhythm. The HOA's overflow parking lot, a modest section of Thomas's pasture, was used sparingly, mostly during holiday parties or community events. Bright yellow signs marked the area, and temporary barriers ensured that vehicles stayed within the designated boundaries. To everyone's surprise, the arrangement worked smoothly. Residents appreciated having extra space when needed, while Thomas found that the leased portion had little impact on his daily farming activities. But beyond the practical benefits, something deeper began to shift. The once hostile relationship between Thomas and the HOA softened into an uneasy but genuine truce. Neighbors who had previously dismissed him as a stubborn outsider started seeing him in a different light. They noticed how hard he worked, tending to his crops at dawn and caring for his animals late into the evening. Some even ventured onto his property, not to argue or demand concessions, but to buy fresh produce from the small farm stand he set up near the edge of his land. At first, these interactions were awkward. Thomas wasn't used to casual conversations with people from the gated community, and many residents felt unsure about approaching him. But over time, the ice melted. Kids giggled as they fed carrots to his goats, parents marveled at the vibrant colors of his homegrown tomatoes, and elderly neighbors swapped stories with him about their own gardening experiences. Slowly but surely, Thomas became less of an outsider and more of a fixture in the community, a quiet yet respected presence. For Sarah Chen, this transformation was particularly rewarding. She had always believed in the power of understanding and compromise, and watching her neighbors warm up to Thomas validated her faith in those principles. Her advocacy during the negotiations hadn't gone unnoticed either. Many HOA members, including some who initially opposed her ideas, now saw her as a voice of reason and fairness. Margaret, though still skeptical of Thomas, begrudgingly admitted that Sarah's approach had saved them all from further conflict. One sunny Saturday morning, the HOA hosted its annual spring fair, a lively event featuring food stalls, live music, and games for children. This year, however, there was a notable addition: a booth showcasing local artisans and farmers. When Sarah invited Thomas to participate, he hesitated at first. "I don't know," he said, scratching the back of his neck. "I'm not really one for crowds." "Come on," Sarah urged with a smile. "You've got the best jams and honey in town. People should get to try them." Eventually, Thomas relented, setting up a simple table adorned with jars of golden honey, homemade preserves, and bundles of fresh herbs. To his astonishment, the response was overwhelming. Families lined up to purchase his products, praising their quality and flavor. Children tugged at their parents' sleeves, begging for another taste of his strawberry jam. By the end of the day, Thomas's stock was nearly depleted, and he left with a pocketful of cash and a newfound appreciation for the value of connection. As the weeks turned into months, the lessons of the dispute lingered in everyone's minds. For Thomas, the experience reinforced his belief in standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. He learned that courage and resilience could win respect, even from those who initially doubted him. For the HOA, the ordeal served as a humbling reminder of the importance of empathy and collaboration. They realized that bulldozing over others' rights only bred resentment, and that true progress came from listening and working together. Even Margaret, whose pride had taken a beating throughout the conflict, softened slightly. Though she still preferred order and control, she began to see the value in flexibility. During a board meeting, she surprised everyone by acknowledging Thomas's contributions to the community. "He may not be part of the HOA," she admitted grudgingly, "but he's proven himself to be a good neighbor." By the time autumn rolled around again, the scars of the past year had begun to fade. What remained was a shared understanding, a fragile but hopeful bond built on mutual respect and compromise. And though challenges would undoubtedly arise in the future, both Thomas and the HOA knew they were better equipped to face them together. On a bright spring afternoon, with the sun casting golden rays over the fields and a gentle breeze rustling through the trees, Thomas Calloway decided it was time to celebrate. The past year had been a whirlwind of challenges, negotiations, and unexpected alliances. But now, as he stood on his farm, looking out at the lush green pasture and thriving crops, he felt a deep sense of peace. It was time to bring people together, not just for business or necessity, but for connection. He invited everyone, neighbors from the HOA, friends he'd made at the farmer's market, and even Margaret Hensley, who surprisingly accepted the invitation without hesitation. Sarah Chen arrived early, helping Thomas set up tables under a canopy near the barn. Together, they arranged jars of honey, baskets of fresh apples, and platters of homemade pies. Kids ran around chasing chickens, while adults mingled awkwardly at first, unsure how to act in this new dynamic where farmer and HOA members were no longer adversaries. As the day unfolded, something remarkable happened. Conversations flowed more easily than anyone expected. Residents complimented Thomas on the quality of his produce, asking questions about farming techniques and sharing their own gardening tips. One man confessed that his tomatoes always turned sour, prompting laughter and advice from others. A group of women gathered around Sarah, thanking her for her role in bridging the gap between the two sides. Even Margaret joined in, sipping lemonade and admitting, albeit reluctantly, that Thomas's apple cider was not bad. Thomas watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. He saw smiles where there had once been scowls, handshakes replacing crossed arms. The bitterness of the past seemed to dissolve under the warmth of shared moments. For the first time, he truly felt like part of the community, not because he lived nearby, but because he belonged. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, Sarah raised a glass to make a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, her voice steady and sincere. "We've learned a lot this year, about standing our ground, listening to each other, and finding common ground. Let's not forget those lessons." Everyone clinked glasses, cheers echoing across the farm. Thomas nodded in agreement, though he didn't say much. Words weren't his strong suit, but actions spoke louder. By opening his home and inviting them into his world, he had shown that bridges could be built, even after they'd burned. That night, as the last guests left, and the farm grew quiet again, Thomas took a moment to reflect. The battle with the HOA had tested him in ways he never imagined, forcing him to dig deep and fight for what mattered most. But it had also taught him resilience, patience, and the power of compromise. More importantly, it reminded him that people aren't always defined by their mistakes. They can change if given the chance. Walking back to his house, Thomas paused to look at the stars twinkling above. His farm was safe, his spirit unbroken, and his future brighter than ever. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. Sometimes, life throws obstacles your way not to break you, but to help you grow stronger, and to remind you that even in the toughest fights, there's room for hope, understanding, and renewal. With a contented sigh, Thomas stepped inside, ready to turn the page to a new chapter, one filled with possibilities instead of conflict.